Humanities Data Series 2022. As part of this series, we have 3 events coming up, and the first is today on the literacies. A quick overview of SIAH. SIAH supports socially engaged, creative and critical research and champions the significance of the arts and humanities in responding to the most pressing issues of contemporary times. This is done primarily in 2 ways. The Institute leads on critical and interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the grand challenges and supports research groupings looking at what it means to be well, how technology makes us, and how we can weather uncertainty. And secondly, the Institute explores the role that arts, culture, and creativity play in contemporary public life. This series brings together guest speakers who are working on significant nationally funded projects to explore how they're engaging with issues of data. So as I've mentioned, we have one on literacies, then next week on civics, and thirdly on inequalities. So without further ado, on to today's event. A very warm welcome to Dr. Elinor Carmi from the Institute, and thank you for sharing your time and research with us today. A quick bio. Dr. Elinor Carmi is a feminist, scholar, journalist and activist working on data literacies, data politics, feminist approaches to data, media and policy. She's a lecturer in media and communications at the sociology department at City University in London, and Dr. Carmi has worked on several projects exploring how people use and understand their data and what the implications are for personal, civic and community agency and imagination. And it's these projects, particularly the Me and My Big Data project, that Elinor will be introducing today. And following Elinor's presentation, I'm very pleased to introduce our discussant, Xiao Wei, who's a postgraduate researcher at WSA. She holds an MA in Globalization and Communication from the University of Leicester and has been teaching and doing research at New Media at Guangxi Normal University of China for 10 years. She is currently working on her doctoral research, Access, Competencies and Outcomes, exploring the daily digital experience of Chinese silver netizens. Xiao's study aims to explore the digital experience of Chinese senior netizens, identify the successes they've achieved, and difficulties encountered in their previous digital practice, as well as their demands for digital inclusion. And then hopefully there'll be a really fascinating meeting point between Elinor and Xiao's research. Following Elinor's presentation, the recording will stop. As I mentioned, we'll move to discussion with Xiao offering some reflections linking to her research and perspectives, and then we'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, Elinor, if you'd like to share your screen and get us started. Welcome and thank you.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. Just let me know if, I think I need to try it again. Love Microsoft Teams. Great. Can you see this?
Almost. Yes. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. I mean, I might have some internet issues, so apologies in advance. So thank you for inviting me for this really amazing kind of series of talks, Dan. I really appreciate it, and I'm really excited about the conversation with Xiao later. So I'm going to dive right into it and kind of tell you a bit about some of the projects that I've been working on in the past few years and also more recently. So in today's talk, I'm mainly going to talk about the Me and My Big Data, developing citizens' data literacies, which was a big project funded by the Newfield Foundation, which we kind of finished around September. So I'm going to talk about that final kind of report that we had. I was also a co-I on Being Alone Together, developing fake news immunity, which was a UKRI project, which I'm going to talk a bit less. And at the moment, I'm working on 2 other projects, which are kind of a continuation of the Me and My Big Data project. One of them is developing a minimum digital living standard, which is also a Newfield Foundation project. And I'm also, I have a parliamentary academic fellowship with the DCMS committee, where I advise them on different kind of digital related things, but especially around data literacies. So I thought about, at the beginning, I thought, should I dive first of all to the project? But I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and basically what you're probably going to hear in the next kind of conversation, has to do with a kind of an early history of the kind of how we engage with kind of digital things online. So I wanted to kind of really briefly go over some of the stuff that I talked about in my book, which is open access and was published in the worst time in history, which was March 2020. But basically in this book, I kind of outline different kind of deviant media behaviors. And in one of the chapters, I dive into notions of spam, but also web cookies. And I try to kind of analyze the way that the digital advertising industry, how they kind of standardized measuring behaviors. And all of this is related to what I'm going to talk a bit later about data literacies, and obviously about the next kind of topics that I saw that you have about civic data and about inequalities, and all of them are interrelated. So if you want to check the book as well, I'm going to shamelessly promote it and say that you can download it for free from the website, so please do so. And again, I'm just going to kind of briefly put you around 20, 30 years back into the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000, where there was the dot-com bubble crash. And, you know, as somebody who examines a lot and studies media history, I think it's quite important to remember that the internet and the web are quite new technologies, and it wasn't that taken for granted that they would be successful. So towards the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000, we started to see with the dot-com bubble crash, we saw a transition of the business model. We had a kind of subscription business model that didn't work so well. And then we saw a movement into another business model, which we know today is kind of based on a different kind of model, which I'm going to touch shortly. But basically, companies like Google and Amazon and later on Facebook and all of these companies started to realize that a different way to kind of offer services would be to offer services for free. And the kind of the money that they would make is through advertising. But it was a very specific type of advertising, which was based on surveillance. So which is often talked about in relation to Shoshana Zuboff surveillance capitalism. And what's really interesting is this kind of the tools that enable this kind of business model. And the main one is web cookies. So web cookies, and I'm not going to go into kind of the specific details of web cookies, but if you do want, I'm analyzing it quite thoroughly in the book. And basically, web cookies are sent to your computer in order to kind of communicate with different kind of advertisers or companies, which could be Google, it could be different kind of ad tech companies, that basically that you become the message. So your behaviors become the message and you become the product. So in the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, this was kind of standardized. And I know maybe the font here is a bit small, but this is an article from The Wired from 2001, where basically the IAB, which is the Interactive Advertising Bureau, they're kind of their head of that organization at the time said that, you know, some people call this spyware, but we use this thing every day. And you could really see how this notion of kind of normalizing surveillance was kind of started at that time. Now, I think one of the most interesting thing, which really relates to the literacies aspect of today's conversation, is that if you can see here, the kind of the extraction of our behaviors and our profiles is happening in the back end of our screen. So usually when I do different kind of exercises with my students about web cookies, and you know, we install different kind of ad blockers, they're quite shocked to understand what's happening in the back end. And the reason behind that is this kind of really slick interface that we have that kind of hides a lot of the stuff that's happening in the back end. Not only web cookies and how we're being traded, but also, you know, how algorithms are ordering different kind of things on our news feeds and different kind of things like that. So this is a really cool project that's in Serbia, which I think is called ShareLab, where you can kind of see the different kind of how our data is being, some call it collected, I like to call it extracted. And here you can see other kind of app permissions that you're kind of giving away in these kind of laborious and really exploitative terms of use that companies like Facebook are using. this is another kind of visualization of what's happening in the back end of our screen and what is called a technology that's called real-time bidding. Facebook developed it further to call it ad auction. And the reason why I'm showing you all of this is that all of this is really related to data literacies, because all of what you're seeing here is basically stuff that the majority of the population doesn't see. And, you know, even as somebody who examined this kind of industry for a long time, it's quite difficult to understand what kind of processes are happening, because first of all, a lot of it is not known to us. These companies don't really share all of that information. And then we don't really understand what consequences it has over our engagement with different kind of technologies. So I kind of wanted to put you in perspective and to kind of give you the background of the project of the data literacies, because all of the way that information and these services kind of operate and kind of how they order and organize our interfaces really relates to what we can do and what we understand and how we engage with these technologies. So I'm going to move into the actual project. And again, you can download the really long report from the Liverpool website, and I really invite you to do so. And I want to kind of acknowledge my other colleagues. So the PI, which is Professor Simeon Yates, Professor Bridget Vessels, Dr. Elinor Lockley, and Dr. Alicia Pavluchuk, who also worked on this project. And basically, this project was submitted right in the time of Cambridge Analytica. And I think that you could really see the way that the public discussion was kind of changing, and that was a really interesting time to kind of examine what do citizens actually understand, how do they engage with their data. It's also important for me to say that we really wanted to focus on adults. I think there is a lot of really great research, for example, from LSE, from Sonia Livingston, and also in policy, there is a lot of focus on the literacies of young people. And I'm really excited to talk with Xiao about this, because I think that literacies of older people is a lot of the time kind of neglected. It's kind of like, oh, they were already in school, so they should know it. And if they don't know it, it doesn't matter because they're not, the new generation. And that is a huge problem for us. And this is something that we discovered that is a huge kind of gap in the literature, but also in policy making. All of the adults, and I'm talking about, people 20, 30 and above, that are kind of in this limbo that don't really have a lot of both projects about them, but also when you talk about legislation, they're kind of left out of the picture. And you can see that, for example, with the online safety bill, which has a really overemphasis on kind of the safety of kids and children. Not that I'm saying that they don't deserve safety and protection, but there is a big population that is kind of left out, and that population also didn't grow with the internet and kind of digital services, so they're kind of in that limbo area. So I really wanted to emphasize that we really wanted to focus on adults in our projects. So when we developed kind of the data citizenship model, which you can see here, I'm sorry again for the font. For some reason, it doesn't show it all over your screen. But basically, So basically, what we did, our project was kind of divided into three main segments. The first one was the literature review, which you can see here, where we kind of wanted to understand what did people say up until now about literacies. And there is a lot of different kind of definitions. You have information literacy, you have media literacy, you have data literacy, you have digital literacy. And we kind of wanted to understand what are the kind of recurring events and what did we feel that was missing. That was the first part. The second part was a national survey, which I'm going to talk about shortly. And the third final part was focus groups, where we wanted to kind of interrogate and focus more deeply on things that kind of emerged in the survey. So in the literature review, what we kind of mainly realized is that while, in information and media kind of related literacies, it was mainly talking about different kind of contents, which was, quite different from the kind of dynamic and interactive interfaces of different kind of websites. So what we wanted to kind of highlight, and we kind of realized that was kind of missing, was two main components. One of them was data thinking, as you can see here. The data thinking is kind of critical thinking and critical understanding of what's happening online, which could mean, For example, how Google and Facebook are sponsored, or, what are web cookies, or what are algorithms. And then the other thing which was extremely missing in the literature was data participation, because a lot of the literature of media or of information or of digital kind of literacies, a lot of the literature focuses on these kind of more practical things. So in the early 2000s, it was, people who can send email, or if you can access different kind of things, if you have the broadband, but there was very little kind of consideration to what kind of skills or what kind of literacies are needed for citizens to actually use different kind of data for their advantage, or if they are already using different kind of data for their advantage. And that could be, for example, to fill out online forms, that could be to organize different kind of protests online, but that could also be to maybe collect different kind of data in order to protest for your local council or your government. And that was a kind of an area of literacies that we felt that was kind of missing. So we formed a new kind of data literacy framework, which we called data citizenship, which consists of what I just said: data thinking, data participation, and data doing, which is more kind of the practical kind of thing, which was mostly already kind of discussed. And here you can kind of see, I hope, although the font is, again, quite small, kind of what we mean, what are kind of practices that are involved with that. So I don't know if you can see, so some of it is around privacy, for example, as I said before, understanding the political economy of what's happening online, understanding data collection, and different kind of things like that. When we talk about data doing, it's stuff around accessing, assessing, and different kind of data manipulation, but also data deletion. So for example, you have different kind of apps, for example, that delete your tweets every couple of months that I use, and different kind of things like that. So that would be data doing. And then data participating, which I already mentioned, which is how can citizens use, both individually and collectively, how they can use their data for their advantage. Now, another thing that we notice in the literature is that when people talk about literacies, both in terms of acquiring, so kind of learning new skills, but also when you're applying different kind of skills, it was always talked about in an individual way. So people were taught, on an individual device, and the kind of practices that were mentioned were very individual. And what we talked about, and what we also realized through the surveys and through the focus groups, is that people actually have what we call networks of literacy. And networks of literacy is the ways in which people engage with other, where and with which media, to gain the digital understandings, skills, and competencies in ways that fits them. So what we realize is that people have these kind of different networks, which could be your friends, your family, or your colleagues at work, or different kind of, people who are experts. And these are people that you would go to learn specific skills. And that would mean that maybe you go to your friends to learn how to do gaming, and you would go to your colleagues to do stuff around political engagement and different kind of things like that. And we wanted to acknowledge that because we really feel that, it's important to remember that we always live in these kind of networked and kind of community manner, and that it's important to remember that also in terms of different kind of interventions that you might want to do in the future, that it's never kind of an individual kind of action, both to learn different kind of literacies, but also then to kind of practice different literacies. So I'm not going to go through the kind of the survey and methods. You can go into that inside the report. What we realized in the survey, we kind of identified 5 kind of user types according to how they engage online. So we discovered extensive political users, extensive users, social and media users, general users, and limited users. And these kind of types of users could really neatly fit into different kind of socioeconomic status, and different kind of education background, and different kind of things like that. And what I want to mainly emphasize, I'm not going to go through all of that. I want to focus mainly on the social and entertainment media users, who we call kind of the young people who usually call themselves digitally natives. And these would be young people that are actually coming from lower kind of socioeconomic status and also lower education attainment. And these kind of users actually, what we realize is that they don't engage in what we call kind of higher data literacies, which means that they would mainly use Facebook or TikTok to get different kind of information. They would mostly actually believe the stuff that they read online. They wouldn't necessarily verify information and different kind of things like that. And so for us, it was really important to demystify the notion of digitally natives. And in fact, in the recent Ofcom family, I think they call it Family and Children Uses and Attitudes report from really like, I think last month, you could also see that a lot of young people think that because they grew up with kind of digital technologies, that they understand it, that they know that. But when you actually ask them about different kind of things, about verifying information, whether a certain thing is, a certain post is fake news or not, they're not that proficient like they think they are. And that exacerbates when, when you come from lower kind of or marginalized groups. So I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the time we kind of take for granted and we kind of do these kind of generalization. Oh, these young kids, they know how to operate everything, where in fact, it's not true. So I'm going to kind of jump on the other kind of users, and I'm going to jump into kind of the questions that we asked in the surveys, kind of the main things that emerged. So checking content online. Some people check, but a lot of people actually check with search engines, and that relates to other sets of problems that a lot of people don't understand, that how these search engines, especially Google, how Google is funded. And then a lot of people don't understand that there could be biases in the kind of results that they engage with. And again, awareness of different kind of data collection. As you can see, I think for us, and maybe I'm jumping a bit ahead, because one of the most interesting findings in our in the focus group, so I am jumping a bit, but it's related to this, is when we asked, one of the first questions that we asked was, what is data? And the majority of people had very limited understanding of what is data. And so people would say, maybe your name and your email and stuff like that, but they couldn't really imagine a lot of the other types of data that a lot of these companies, specifically Facebook and Google and Amazon, the kind of stuff that they, spy on you and extract from you, and then they trade on you. And that is really important, because a lot of the kind of all of this system of exploitation is built on different kind of contracts that ask us if we're happy to give our data. But if the majority of people don't really understand what data is, then a lot of these kind of the consent mechanism is quite flawed, because that means that people don't really understand the very basic definition of that. And at the end, I'm going to emphasize that another kind of consequence of that is that if you don't really know what data is, then you can't really kind of exercise different kind of rights that you have relating to data, specifically the GDPR. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're seeing, some people are not really aware of data collection, that they don't really understand the basic definition of what is data. And I say that, they do know slightly, maybe very few categories, but they can't really imagine that it could be their religion, their sexual orientation, different kind of preferences, whether they going to different kind of websites, what kind of device they're using, their location, all of this kind of stuff. The majority of people do not comprehend what, that all of these kind of data points are involved in this kind of data extraction and trading. So again, kind of thinking about acceptability of tailored services data collection. Some people say that they like the fact that it's kind of personalized. So, that's one aspect. But when you actually ask them about influencing and third-party sharing, they actually don't really like that. And we also saw that with other kind of, sorry, I'm going to jump that. I think it's quite interesting that the majority of people didn't really trust social media platforms. And we saw that re-emerging in the focus groups as well, that most people don't feel comfortable, but also feel that they're kind of, that they don't have a choice, because that's where they kind of interact with their friends and colleagues, or, you know, even work related stuff. So that, I think, is something that's really important. And a key kind of finding that we found is just because things are free does not mean that data sharing is okay. So, you know, that's one of the kind of the key finding that we found, that people don't really want to share data, but they don't feel that they have a choice. And a lot of the things that emerged later on, because we kind of wanted to understand a bit more behind that in the focus groups. And again, we would hear from people, I don't really want to share data, but I don't, you know, I don't feel that I have a lot of other choices, or a lot of other kind of platforms. And that is related to the fact that a lot of people also are not aware that there are alternative platforms. So for example, DuckDuckGo, which is a search engine that doesn't spy on your behavior, the majority of people, when we mentioned that, didn't even know that that exists. Or web browsers such as Brave, a lot of people don't really know, because they use the kind of things that everybody is using at the moment. So kind of from our analysis of the survey data, we've identified kind of key characteristics. On many points of the literacy, knowledge, practices, and awareness, respondents scored highly. Very few people scored highly. So very few people actually have high data literacies. And except for very few kind of people, the proportion of any of our user groups showing specific knowledge of practices are rarely above 70%. So that means that only a small proportion of respondents have a deep and broad data literacy envisioned in our data citizenship framework, which is kind of like an ideal framework. Low levels of use, kind of, or narrow use, which is what I talked about, the kind of the digitally natives, are kind of correlate with awareness and limited action, and responses to specific aspects of data literacies, and our overall data literacies measure strongly corresponds to our 5 user type. Not surprisingly, given this correspondence, data literacy scores are statistically correlated with key demographics such as education, age, and socioeconomic status. And so moving on to the kind of the focus groups, the kind of the things that emerged, and we have more papers coming up about that as well. So limited or little understanding of how the digital system and media work, and this I already talked about. So very few people actually know basic definitions such as data. Very few understand the kinds of data platforms can and do track. Limited or no understanding of the potential and potential consequences of data tracking and trading. Limited or no understanding of which organizations and technological entities are involved in the digital ecosystem. So I think this is quite important as well, because a lot of these companies such as, you know, Facebook and Google, you know, if you actually read their terms of use, which I have for my book, you know, it would always read, you know, we share data with our partners, or we share data with third parties. And the majority of people don't really imagine, or don't really understand which other data companies are involved in this kind of data trade. So they don't, the majority, for example, doesn't even realize that governments also have and are part of this data trade. And a lot of them don't beyond Facebook and Google, which are kind of trademark names, they can't really imagine which kind of companies are involved. And that is problematic, because if you don't know who is involved in this kind of data trade, you can't really object, right? So a lot of the kind of the data rights that we have as part of the GDPR is about maybe data deletion, or if you want, you know, you want to negotiate, or you want to kind of to get all of the data that a certain company has on you. But if you don't know all of the companies that are involved in this process, you can't really, you know, exercise that right as well. So I'm not going to read all of this because I see that my time is running out. So I'm just gonna flick through some other kind of insights that we have. There is a strong feeling of disempowerment. So feeling disempowered in relation to and by social media platforms, background feelings of worry and anxiety over uses of their data by platforms and systems, lack of confidence in their digital efficacy in regards to managing and protecting personal data, and concerns over the potential to be manipulated. So a thing that kind of emerged a lot is that a lot of people didn't really know, like a lot of people care about protecting their data and doing different kind of actions about that. A lot of them mentioned that they don't really know where to look for information, how to know that. A lot of people felt overwhelmed by this and that they don't have time to do different kind of things like that. And again, I think that this is really important because if you don't really know where to go and you feel disempowered, then again, I think the kind of the notion of doing any kind of actions as citizens and to exercise our right to maybe refuse, negotiate, object, different kind of things that big technology companies are doing is minimized. And again, I'm not going to read all the quotes. I'm sorry, it's just a lack of time. In terms of trust, we can see kind of particular patterns that the use of social media as a primary source of information. So a lot of people, when we ask them where would they look for stuff, they would say Google search, which is a bit concerning, as I said before, because most people don't know that it is sponsored by advertising. So they don't really know that some of the top kind of results could be skewed, could be biased. And in fact, Google was sued 2 times already by the European Commission about kind of prioritizing their own products and demoting other products. So this is kind of a really big issue and a concern. I'm gonna skip. Yeah, so a lot of the kind of, when it comes to kind of networks of literacies, one of the things that we discovered that a lot of people kind of ask their family, their friends, or people that they feel comfortable with to kind of get more knowledge, to learn new skills. So that is a point of kind of a possible kind of intervention. But that also means that, you know, this kind of support mechanism and a community mechanism could be an advantage, but it could also be a disadvantage if your community is marginalized and the people around you are not that proficient. That means that you may also not have the ability or the appropriate skills to kind of learn new skills that you know. So kind of concluding the focus groups, and again, I'm sorry that I moved very quickly, but if you want to read everything, then you're more than welcome to check out the actual report. So the depth and breadth of knowledge about the collection, tracking, use of data by platforms is best described as patchy. It is especially limited for those people who have low digital skills and limited or narrow uses of digital systems. And this is what I said before. All respondents feel unease and differing in different kind of levels of disempowerment around how platforms collect their data, the uses to which they put it in, and the potential of kind of the third-party trading of their data. The processes to verify information, the learning of new skills, or the development of better awareness are tied to users' networks of literacy. And I'm gonna kind of stop here because I want to give Xiao a chance to respond as